today I'm going to teach you how you can structure a guitar practice for maximum efficiency. Now this is a form of accelerated learning technique. It's something that I was taught when I went to music school, and it's something that I've always utilised as a guitar teacher, both in the way that I structure my lessons and the way that I've always learnt myself. And it really does work, and it's really worth your while investing your time in. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the way we learn, the way we intake information, and we're going to structure the things that we practice around that to make sure that we're getting the most out of it that we actually can. So I'm going to start by showing you this little chart, and it shows you a typical learning curve. Now this is common sense to most people, but when you start learning, when you start practicing, that's when you intake most of the information that you're looking at. And as we kind of go along throughout time, the amount of information we intake just starts to kind of drop off around that 20-minute mark. Now we're still learning at that point, but we're intaking less of the information that we're looking at. So what we want to do is we want to design the different things we do as guitarists and the different types of things we can learn to make sure that we're taking advantage of where this curve drops off and where it's at its highest, to make sure that things we're practicing are going to be efficient. So to start off with, we're going to look at the warm-up. Now the warm-up really does need to be short, if at all, depending on what you're going to be learning during your practice. Now 2 minutes is plenty enough. You may stretch it to 4 depending on what you're going to be working on. But what you don't want to do during your warm-up is to work on any kind of spurious exercises that are just patterns and don't really mean very much. Because at that point, that's where you're learning. So you want to make sure you're actually learning something during that period. So I recommend this is where you do some sort of low-intensity learning that gets your fingers warmed up, but it still has some value to you in terms of learning your instrument. A great example of this is a perfect time to practice and learn your scales. Whether it's one you already know and you just want to rehearse it and get it into your mind, or whether it's a new one that you're starting from fresh, because you're more likely to remember it at this time. Now you may even like to incorporate this into the rest of your practice. For example, if you're learning a particular song and you know the key, well, you can warm up just by practicing and running through a few of the scale positions at the start of your practice session. It's all you need. It keeps things fresh, and it doesn't cause you any issues in terms of injuries with fingers because it will warm you up nice and gently. Beyond that point, after the 2 minutes, this is the point where you really need to focus on your practice. This is the point where you learn the most that you are looking at. So any kind of structured practice, if you're learning something new and intense, this is where you need to focus your time. Now this is where you can learn anything. So it could be you're learning a new technique and you're really going to focus on it. And if you're learning technique, you'll find that during this period, this is a great time just to have a series of small drills that kind of work up through whatever technique you're doing with certain goal points. Any technique only needs a couple of minutes. If you're doing small repetitions of something, a bit like going to a gym, you're just doing repetition after repetition, you can get quite a lot into small areas, and you can build it up to give yourself a nice little routine. If you're working on something more for the mind, again, this is a brilliant time to do it, or the best time to do it, I should say, because you're going to be taking information in. So you can look at anything intense during this period. This is really, if you're going to learn something and you have a purpose to your practice session, this is really where you want to make sure you're studying it. Now you notice at the 20-minute point, that's where things start to drop off. Now this is different for different people, but it's usually around the 20-minute mark, so you might have to do a bit of experimentation. It's a really good idea to use a stopwatch or a timer and really structure your practice down to the minute to make sure you know how this kind of affects you. But after this point, you don't really intake much information. So this is where you have some decisions to make. Now you can continue practicing. There's nothing to say you have to put down your guitar at this point. But you might like to switch what you're practicing or turn off certain elements of it so that you're working on things that you still get some use out of. So whilst your learning drops at this point, the rate of information that you're intaking, it doesn't mean that you can't work on motor skills. So you can still practice technique after this point. Obviously, if you've had a hard technique practice for the previous 20 minutes, you might want to drop off in terms of intensity. But this is still a great time to put on a metronome, do some exercises that work on certain techniques that are reasonably light, short and concise, and work on those kind of motor skills that won't do any harm. Equally, what you've already learnt during 20 minutes, this is a great time just to carry on with that same thing. Not necessarily learning more, but just go over what you've already done, just reinforce it. Alternatively, you could use this time to warm down and do something a bit more light-hearted. So this is a great time just to do general playing. You'll still learn a lot of information. You'll still be refining your skills by doing general playing during this period. Or it's also a great time to work on things like improvisation, where you're just putting things that you already know, so you're not necessarily learning something new, and you're putting it into practice. So it's a great period for reinforcement and doing gentle exercises, gentle playing, and just general practice that isn't going to be too new for you, where you really need to learn something new. Now, if you have longer than this to learn, so I've given a 45-minute practice session here, then you might like to split this up a little bit differently. So if you had 2 hours to practice, whilst you could quite easily fill up 2 hours, it is very much worthwhile having a break during that period. Because the nice thing is with any of this stuff is that when you stop and do something completely different with your mind, you completely refresh. You take that chart right back to that start point, and you probably won't need to warm up the second time round. So if you had 2 hours practice, you could do 20 minutes, put the guitar down, go and get a cup of tea, come back and start afresh, and you can really work on learning lots of intense information. So that's it for today. Very short and sweet. It's just about understanding and putting some structure into the way you practice, understanding the way that you learn. You'll have to vary as to the way that you learn and what you're working on. But just try and have some sort of structure that focuses on learning certain things at certain points so that you're always getting the most out of your practice. The worst thing you can do is sit down for a practice and spend a whole hour practicing the scales, or trying to learn something new after having a half-hour warm-up. Completely pointless. So make sure whatever you do is focus on when your learning points are the highest, and when your learning points are at the lowest, relax, play guitar for fun. Just do things that are useful for keeping you in check. If you have any questions or have any learning techniques of your own, accelerated learning is a big subject. This is just about structure. Please do drop them below. Feel free to ask any questions. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.